Welcome to AP Euro for Winners.
Today, we are starting Unit 2 with talking about Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation.
The first thing we need to understand is a little bit of context, and we're going to talk about that in the frame of criticisms of the Catholic Church. So, from about 1450 to 1648, religious beliefs and practices changed in Europe because of this thing called the Protestant Reformation and how they criticize the Catholic Church. And so, let's talk about what their criticisms of the Catholic Church are. First one is clerical immorality, which is the idea that priests are breaking church rules. Some examples of these would be drunkenness and celibacy. Now, celibacy is, priests are supposed to take a vow of celibacy in the Catholic Church, which means they're not supposed to have sex. But we see a lot of priests having kids, even some popes having kids that they wouldn't call their kids; they call them nephews. But so we see people breaking that, and that's a big issue for some people. We see this idea of priestly ignorance, which is basically that the priests are not as educated as they should be. Some priests are illiterate, and that means they're not as able to teach their followers the faith. This is a big problem in Italy. It's not so much a problem in Northern Europe, but still it's something people are concerned about. And then we're going to get into some other terms which are probably new to you. One of them is called pluralism. So, pluralism is the practice of holding multiple church positions. So, for example, you might be a priest in one area and in a total different area, which gives you more power, and it's not something you're supposed to be able to do. Next is an idea called simony. So, this is where you are selling or purchasing religious positions. And this is a big issue because we're not supposed, it's basically legal bribery within the Catholic Church, right? You're not supposed to be able to do this. And this even goes all the way up to a pope. One of the popes, named Pope Leo X, was actually a Medici, that really wealthy banking family from Italy. And they actually get, through simony, his way into becoming a pope, which is something a lot of people have a problem with, obviously. Next on the list is nepotism, which is when you are giving church positions to relatives. So you would give a position to your nephew or something like that, which is something people have an issue with. And last is the selling of indulgences, which is essentially where you are allowed to purchase getting out of your sins. So let's say you commit a sin, you can give money and your sin's forgiven. And now you can go to heaven. And one famous example of this is this guy named John Tetzel. He was a German friar, a German preacher, and he sells so many indulgences so that he can build St. Peter's Basilica, which is something that becomes highly criticized because, again, this is not something that a lot of people were fans of.
So let's take those criticisms and see what actually it turns into. And we're going to call that the Protestant Reformation. It's a religious, cultural, political, and intellectual revolution that's challenging the views held by Catholics because of those criticisms that they didn't like. And this is going to manifest itself in the creation of 5 new branches of Protestantism. If you look at this graphic below, right, we see the Great Schism is another name for it, where it breaks off. You see Catholicism breaking off into 5 different ones. And those are Lutheranism, Calvinism, Anabaptism, Huguenots, and Puritans, each of which we're going to deep dive into right about now.
Another idea for context is the printing press, which we've mentioned before. But we need to understand that without the printing press, the Protestant Reformation probably does not happen because this allows people to voice how they're upset with the church and to spread all their new religious ideas that become, that are part of this Protestant idea. They're spread through the printing press. And one famous person and work is Erasmus, and he has a work called In Praise of Folly, which is important to know, which gets mass produced on the printing press, and it's a criticism of the Catholic Church. And we'll see a lot of these people have texts that get printed on the Catholic Church. Printed on the printing press, which are going to criticize the Catholic Church.
All right, so let's begin with Lutheranism. Lutheranism starts with this guy named Martin Luther. He's a German professor, priest, and author, and he's inspiring the foundation of Lutheranism, the first Protestant religion. So let's track how this happens a little bit. It starts off in the early 1500s. Luther's going to publish a really famous book called 95 Theses in Germany. And in that book, he criticizes the selling of indulgences. Remember, those criticisms of the Catholic Church. He clearly is not going to be liked by the Catholic Church for doing this. So they're like, all right, you need to recant your beliefs. And he doesn't do that. So then he ends up going to what we call the Diet of Worms. And again, without the printing press, he wouldn't have been able to publish and mass produce his 95 Theses. So then fast forward, He's at the Diet of Worms, which is pretty much a trial against Luther, where he's accused of heresy, which is just going against the Catholic Church at this time because that was illegal. He's found guilty. He's again asked to recant the views. He refuses, so the Catholic Church decides to excommunicate him. So he has to go, leave, and get out. Then they have a thing called the Peasant Wars are going to happen, and we go into this again with a whole slide coming up. But so for now, just know that it does impact Luther. There's this thing that happens. And then in response, Luther is going to publish his catechism, which is just this fancy word for a publication of an outline of beliefs used to teach people. And in particular, he's aiming at making a Q&A book to teach children about Lutheranism and kind of the differences that he sees should be made. Then he's going to continue. Well, what's interesting about Luther is he didn't wake up and was like, all right, I'm going to start my own religion. I want all these people to follow me. He kind of ended up doing that accidentally. He was just expressing his beliefs and his criticisms of the Catholic Church. People start reading his book because it's printing press, and more followers are following Luther and what he has to say and all of his stuff that he's publishing. So he actually kind of creates this religion accidentally through his followers. All right, let's go over some differences and similarities. So we have Catholicism on the left and Lutheranism on the right. They both believe that Christ is the Savior. They both follow under Christianity. Bible is a holy book. That they're the same. They're not diverting yet. But then we have Catholicism, who really likes the Pope. Pope is going to be kind of the in-between between God and the people. Whereas Lutheranism, they don't like the Pope. They think the Bible is better than the Pope, right? So they're going to do more of interpretation of the Bible for themselves and not just believe what one person thinks. And then for Catholicism, they have a strict hierarchy of the clergy, right? A power and position. Whereas Lutheranism believes that everyone is part of the priesthood. Everyone should be the same. Everyone is the same in the eyes of God. So why is there this hierarchy, right? Then moving on, in Catholicism, you confess your sins through the priest, which goes back to what Mr. Johnson said about those criticisms that people had because you could buy those confessions and absolve yourself of your sins. Whereas in Lutheranism, they really want you to just pray to God for forgiveness. It's not an instant forgiveness. You have to ask for that forgiveness. And then in Catholicism, faith and good works save people. That's the belief. But in Lutheranism, they think that faith is enough for heaven, right? So if you sin, it happens. If you keep good faith and pray throughout your whole life, you can still reach heaven. And then lastly, the difference, you're going to see really big, fancy, ornate churches with Catholicism. You even see those standing today. And then in Lutheranism, they just want simple places. They don't really want the big, extravagant churches and buildings. So those are some similarities and differences.
Now we want to go into a little bit about those peasant wars that we mentioned a couple of slides ago. Now we've actually already talked about these peasant wars in the slides about the commercial revolution. So you can see that, a screenshot of that slide on the top right to refresh your memory. So if we think back to that, the commercial revolution is an economic and cultural shift due to the revolutionization of banking and agriculture and the market economy. And so this is going to create a negative impact on peasants through things like the enclosure acts, which, remember, those are when the commons get acquired by the nobles and they get taken away from the peasants. There's going to be new taxes on the peasants, and a lot of the peasants in Germany had been given more freedom in the previous decade because of the labor shortage, and so they're frustrated when some of that freedom gets taken away. But there's also social causes which we need to get into more now. And one of those ideas is Lutheranism. So remember, Lutheranism has this idea of the doctrine of the priesthood of all believers, right? So everyone is equal in the eyes of the church. So the German peasants kind of take this idea and they're thinking, well, then why can't peasants challenge the social and the political hierarchy that's existing in the German states right now? They want that social equality that Luther is saying they should have within religion. So the peasants are saying, well, let's take this into, our personal lives, the political and social aspect of our lives. Well, here's the outcome of this, and I think it's kind of interesting. Well, first of all, the peasant armies fail. Okay, they don't have really good communication. They have an inferior military. The nobles are going to win, and they're going to restore the order that used to be. Okay, but what's really interesting is that Martin Luther writes this book, which has got a great name. It's called "Against the Murderous, Thieving Hordes of Peasants." And he actually condemns the peasants. He says, look, the peasants are not in the right here. Um, so you might think that Luther would support the peasants, but Luther chooses not to support them. And there's some political reasons for this. And we're not going to tell the whole story, but essentially, when he gets excommunicated from the Catholic Church, one of those nobles in Germany supports him and kind of hides Luther. And the peasant wars are going on in this person's land. It's in some level. And so he has some political reason to side with the nobles because he doesn't want to get kicked out from the guy who's protecting him. Okay, so Luther's in this weird position where he's challenging the Catholic Church religiously, but he's not going far enough to say we also need to challenge the political hierarchy of the same period. So the Peasant Wars is a really great way to think about like kind of the nuance of all of this and how there's some political issues with the Protestant Reformation and religious issues. It's not just black and white.
All right, let's move on to Calvinism. This is started by John Calvin, who's a French professor, priest, and author. He, again, is founding Calvinism. It's another Protestant religion after Lutheranism because he was able to see what Luther did with his catechism and his ability to move away from the church and the use of the printing press. So it inspires him to do something further because he also sees the criticisms of the Catholic Church and agrees, but he wants to take it one step differently than Luther did. So again, we have the mid 1500s as opposed to the early 1500s. Calvin's going to convert to Protestantism. He bases his ideas off of what he wants different to Lutheranism, which we'll have in the next slide. And he publishes his Institutes of the Christian Religion, another book that outlines his beliefs. He's able to express and disseminate due to the printing press. He gains followers. But like we saw with heresy, it gets him exiled too. So he goes and has his exile in Geneva. Geneva accepts him, so he kind of chills out there. Well, while he's in Geneva, he actively aims to start spreading his religion and gain more followers. So let's just think back to Luther real quick, who wasn't actively trying to gain followers or start a new religion. It just kind of happened passively. With Calvin, he went there for the aim of making this new style of religion, getting his word out, adding more followers. So that was his goal there. He wanted to be a religious leader and make it official.
So let's break down some of the differences and similarities again between Catholicism and Calvinism. But this time, the only things we're really going to talk about is how Calvinism is different than Lutheranism, which we've bolded on the right. So, one of the key differences, which is kind of a political difference, is how in Catholicism, right, they think the Bible is the holy book, which is a similarity with Lutheranism. And Calvinists also agree with that. But Calvinists are going to go one step further and they're going to say, well, we need to take the Bible and make it into our political laws as well. And so we'll see how Calvin does that with Geneva. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Another idea that's a little bit different than Lutheranism is the hierarchy of the clergy. We see that Calvinism is a little bit less strict than the Catholic Church. He has this idea of the clergy of the faithful. And then lastly, and another really important one, is this idea of predestination. So remember, in Catholicism, they think that faith and good works save them. But in Calvinism, they have this idea of predestination. And this is an important new concept. Basically, this means that people are born good or bad. And God already knows if you're good or bad, if you're going to hell or heaven. And so this is kind of a unique idea in Calvinism. So that's just something important to point out. So the rest of that is pretty similar to Lutheranism because remember, they're both Protestant.
So let's deep dive into Calvin's Geneva, right, and see Calvin's impact on Geneva. This is again in Switzerland. So a group of Calvinist followers are going to create a town council in Geneva. So they're basically going to overtake and revamp Geneva. It's this area that they ended up being in and establish a republican form of government. And this government is going to determine legislation, both secular legislation and religious laws. Like we saw in the last slide, the Bible is law, right? So they're going to have a little bit secular as well, but mostly religious law. And then you have a group called the Consistory, which is going to be a council of pastors and common people in Geneva that help to reinforce the town council. They're going to identify people who break laws and they're going to punish them, right? So they're checking people's homes or reporting offenders to the magistrate. They're going to kind of monitor prohibited activities, like if you miss service, if you're wearing bright colors, if you gamble, you swear, you commit adultery, if you're accused or seen doing witchcraft, right? You're also not allowed to pray in Latin because they want the vernacular tongue, right? They want everyone being the same. Pilgrimages are also going to be prohibited activities. So if you're seen doing any of these, the consistory is going to report you and then you're going to be punished. Some of the punishments are going to be executions, accusations of heresy, which means you're going to trial, banishment. Then they're not all that extreme. Sometimes they're more milder, like fines, imprisonment, public whippings, public recantings of your beliefs, use of stocks, as you see in the picture on the right, so people can see that you did all these bad things and you kind of get humiliated. So it's really interesting to see how Calvin's ideas, how much his followers are willing to kind of take them and run with them and then back him as well in this.
Now let's talk about another branch of Protestantism called the Huguenots. So this is in the 1560s, and it's a group specific to France. So remember, we talked about how Lutheranism is kind of in Germany, which is the Holy Roman Empire at the time, and Calvinism is in Geneva. But the Huguenots are in France. So they have the. We want to make sure we understand that the idea of Protestantism is spreading all across of Europe, which is going to be a big threat to the Catholic Church. So these are French Calvinists and nobles. And one thing, kind of again, another political idea here in this big religious talk is that nobles have incentive to become Protestant at the time because then they get the land that had been previously owned by the Catholic Church. So the nobles in France, some of them do become Protestant because they get some political power through there. But this is still a minority of the French people because France is still heavily Catholic. So the Huguenots are creating a challenge, right? They're challenging the French monarchy, who is still Catholic, and they're challenging the Catholic Church, just like all the Protestant groups are. And what are the Huguenots' demands? Well, they want freedom of religion. They want to be able to practice their religion within France. They want to reduce the power and the influence of the Catholic Church, and they want more political rights. And they're going to use this religious lens to try to get more political rights. And we'll see that the Huguenots kind of get started and start these things called the Wars of Religion, which we're going to talk about in a future lesson.
All right, then we have another religious group called the Puritans, and this is a group specific to England. As we're seeing again, the ideas of Protestantism are spreading thanks to the printing press and going even further around Europe. So, Puritans are made up of English people influenced by Calvin who want to turn more towards what we're going to call Puritanism. So, let's go back a little bit and add some context. So, right after King Henry VIII is going to declare himself head of the Church of England, right? Think back to Unit 1. He already decreases the power of the Catholic Church in England, right? He opens the door for more disagreement with the church for the common people because he's the one that starts this. And then Elizabeth I, which is King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn's daughter, takes over control of England, and she does what her father's doing. She continues to distance the monarchy from the Catholic Church. Well, the English monarchy is again becoming less Catholic. People start to like this. This is becoming the norm, and it increases a lot of the anti-Catholic sentiment across England amongst English people, right? So we have all those same reasons, the distrust of the Catholic Church, all of that from the first slide. So some people start to think that the monarchy actually isn't going far enough to distance itself from the Catholic Church. Elizabeth I tries to create compromise between Catholics and Protestants by allowing people to privately be Catholic, right? Think back to her dad getting rid of the Catholic Church, so people were a little bit afraid to be Catholic. But she's like, nope, it's okay. I'm going to try to keep peace. You can do it as long as it's privately. But the Puritans really wanted the purification of the Anglican Church, which is the English church, away from any Catholic influence at all, whether it's private or public. They want it all gone. So they try to remove all the Catholics from England. This is what they want, right? And they want power to go to the parliament away from the church even more. Well, England doesn't meet their demands. So what happens is a lot of them end up leaving England and travel to the Americas to kind of practice their religion. And that's a different story, but that's kind of the origins of what we now know as the United States.
Our last group we're going to talk about is called the Anabaptists, which is again another branch of Protestantism. And what is unique about Anabaptists is they believe in this idea of adult baptism. So they have a membership of only adult believers. They don't think that kids are old enough to make that church. So kids aren't baptized. And if you're an Anabaptist, Anabaptist literally means that they're going to have adults be baptized. So, they don't think that kids should be able to do that. They focus on the New Testament, which is a strict interpretation, and they use that as a source for all their rules. And they are very critical of sin. They think that sin is everywhere. And the Anabaptists, especially compared to a lot of these other groups, even more so, are shunned by the outside world. They often have to meet in homes, not meet in churches. They don't see the same political power as some of these other groups. They're not involved in any wars. So as a result, the Anabaptists are kind of targeted by other Catholics and even by other Protestants because of their very strict and devout beliefs. So I know that that was a lot to go over. These are the historical developments from AP, but it's really important that we see the Protestant Reformation, we see the context for it, we see the religious factors in it, we see the political factors, and we're able to differentiate between these different ideas. So hopefully that helped cleared it up for you.
We want to thank you all for watching and giving a special shout out for our amazing AP Euro students listening to this. See you all for the next video on the wars of religion.
Until then, bye.